Hi, I'm Blake Lively, and I'm going to be taking the BuzzFeed quiz, which iconic Blake Lively character?
Hey besties, welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving into something wild, something that connects Hollywood, social media, and a layer of celebrity PR that is making people question everything. You know how we've been watching Blake Lively's legal saga unfold over the past year? Well, things are taking a new twist because now Taylor Swift is somehow getting pulled into a narrative that mirrors Blake's previous situation, and it's raising eyebrows across social media, Reddit, and even mainstream outlets like Rolling Stone. Yes, that's right, Rolling Stone. The article in question framed the discussion around a so-called smear campaign, claiming that bots were orchestrating an inorganic attack on Taylor Swift following the release of her new album, The Life of a Showgirl, in October 2024. And they made an unusual connection to the supposed summer 2024 smear campaign against Blake Lively. But here's the kicker, there's no concrete evidence linking these events. Rolling Stone reported on the claims as if there was a direct line from Blake's case to Taylor's online situation, but in reality, the only evidence comes from a small, largely unknown company called Goodia. According to the article, this company analyzed thousands of social media posts and identified a pattern of coordinated, inauthentic activity that supposedly influenced public discourse around Swift's album. Sounds alarming, right? But when you dig deeper, the methodology is extremely thin. They counted posts, identified users, but they didn't explain their sampling methods, the algorithms used, or how they even verified the authenticity of the activity. It's the kind of report that makes you raise an eyebrow immediately because the metrics, if they exist at all, are never disclosed. And yet, Rolling Stone published it as if it were a bombshell, linking it implicitly to Blake Lively's past situation and, more controversially, hinting that Justin Baldoni might somehow be involved. That last part is completely unsubstantiated, but you can see how readers, fans, and critics all started spinning in circles. Fans of Swift, known as the Swifties, began debating fiercely in the comments section, while supporters of Justin Baldoni were like, hold up, what does this have to do with him at all? Suddenly, Reddit threads exploded with speculation, screenshots, and people trying to trace what was real, what was manufactured, and what was simply conjecture. And it doesn't stop there. The Verge got involved and tried to unpack the story, giving more clarity about Goodia, the company behind the report. Goodia claims to monitor rising narratives online to give clients insight into trends, polarizing topics, and audience segmentation. But crucially, they are not analyzing truth versus falsehood. Their analysis focuses on how content spreads and how it polarizes users. That's a far cry from proving that Taylor Swift is the target of a coordinated bot campaign or that any smear campaign is being orchestrated. The Verge also confirmed that Rolling Stone did not commission the report and that Taylor Swift is not a Goodia client. This raises further questions. If Taylor and her team were not involved, why did her publicist Tree Payne respond in a way that refused to go on record but wanted to provide background information? If there is no involvement, why even speak at all? It's a subtle but telling detail that makes one wonder if some coordination or messaging oversight happened behind the scenes. Now let's look at the timing. Rolling Stone published this report around the same period that Blake Lively's court documents were being unsealed. Some of these documents showed communications between Taylor and Blake during Blake's takeover of a film project, and text messages between Taylor, Blake, and others that suggested deeper involvement than publicly acknowledged. This creates an optics problem. Even if Taylor Swift had nothing to do with Goodia's report, the timing makes it appear as though there is a connection, and that's enough for outlets and fans to start drawing lines that may not exist. Moreover, the report attempted to classify criticism of Swift as either organic or inauthentic. They labeled a lot of the criticism regarding racial symbolism, cultural appropriation, and lyric interpretation as bot-driven, while simultaneously ignoring legitimate conversations around her album's quality, production choices, or lyrical content. To anyone paying attention, this is a red flag. It's not uncommon for celebrity PR teams to want to frame criticism as inauthentic, but here it seems like an entire media outlet regurgitated the report without critical analysis, further amplifying the narrative without questioning the source. And the story doesn't end there. Goodia is a company that's only been around since 2023, and beyond this report, there's virtually no track record. No major clients, no published methodologies, and extremely limited staffing information. Critics of Taylor pointed out that it looks suspiciously convenient. A small, unknown company produces a report that casts doubt on legitimate criticism, the report lands in the hands of a journalist sympathetic to Swift, and a major media outlet publishes it as though it were fact. There's no transparency, no peer review, nothing to ensure credibility. Yet the narrative spreads online, fan bases debate endlessly, and the public consumes it as though it's gospel. On social media platforms like TikTok, YouTube, and Twitter, people began producing content reacting to the Rolling Stone article, amplifying the discussion even further. Some users shared videos framing Taylor as a victim of Nazi bots, while others mocked the idea entirely, saying the discourse only reflected typical fandom and anti-fandom behavior around a high-profile album release. The result? Chaos, confusion, and a massive flood of conflicting information that mirrors the frenzy that surrounded Blake Lively's case last year. Essentially, we're watching history repeat itself, not because the facts are identical, but because the patterns of media amplification, PR influence, and fan interpretation are eerily similar. By tying Taylor Swift's album release to an inauthentic bot narrative, the conversation moves from legitimate critique into a grey area where perception, rumour, and insinuation dominate. And while Taylor's PR team did not commission the report, the decision to remain off-record while providing background information adds another layer of opacity that fuels speculation. Now, what about the timing and overlap? Fans noticed that the reporting and Taylor's album release coincided with high-profile developments in Blake Lively's legal case, which had already been dominating headlines. The optics of two celebrity narratives unfolding simultaneously created a perception of continuity, even though the individuals, cases, and social media dynamics are not directly connected. But because some overlapping fan bases exist and the narratives were packaged together, the public perceives a linkage that may not actually exist. At the same time, Rolling Stone's article repeatedly emphasized coordinated inauthentic activity without providing enough detail to assess its validity, essentially inviting readers to accept the conclusion without critical scrutiny. This is exactly the type of amplification that savvy media consumers need to be aware of. Part of what makes this story complex is the interplay between small data firms like Goodyear, major media outlets like Rolling Stone, and the power of celebrity PR. Each party has a role. Goodyear collects and interprets data, Rolling Stone publishes and contextualizes it for mass consumption, and PR teams manage the messaging around it. When any one part of that chain is opaque or misinterpreted, the narrative can spiral in unintended directions, as we're seeing here. And if we take a step back, the narrative being constructed around Taylor Swift mirrors some of the tactics we observed in Blake Lively's situation last year. Both cases involve allegations of smear campaigns, both involve media amplification, and both involve a small number of online actors being framed as larger coordinated operations. The difference is in scale and context, but the media patterns are unmistakable. What's fascinating here is the psychological impact on fans and the broader audience. When you frame legitimate criticism as part of a bot-driven smear, it not only invalidates genuine discourse but also encourages defensiveness, polarization, and echo chambers. And this is exactly what appears to have happened following Rolling Stone's coverage of Taylor Swift. By presenting the report as though it has definitive conclusions about bot activity, readers are prompted to either blindly defend Swift or dismiss all criticism entirely, creating an artificial divide. And the kicker? Despite all the waves of misinformation, criticism, and speculation, the underlying facts, Taylor's actions, album sales, and fan responses remain measurable. Yet the framing of the story amplifies perceptions over reality, which is exactly the dynamic that keeps audiences debating endlessly online. And that's just part 1. Stay tuned, because in part 2, we're going to dive even deeper into the connections, the timing, the PR decisions, and why this may signal a larger trend of celebrities using media manipulation strategies to control narratives. It's getting really wild, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss the next part. Now that we've set the stage with how Goodyear's report made its way into Rolling Stone and stirred up the Taylor Swift fan universe, let's unpack why this is far from a coincidence and why it's becoming a textbook example of modern celebrity PR in action. First, let's talk about timing. As I mentioned in part 1, this report dropped just as Blake Lively's court documents were being unsealed. That's important because these documents showed communications between Taylor Swift and Blake Lively, including text messages during Blake's involvement with a film project and moments that suggested Taylor was at the penthouse when Ryan Reynolds reportedly lost his cool with Justin Baldoni. Now, imagine this: mainstream media publishes a report implying Taylor is the target of a bot-driven smear campaign at the exact same time her name is popping up in unsealed court documents connected to Blake. To the average reader, that overlap looks like more than coincidence, it looks like orchestration. And that's exactly the effect PR teams want, to create a narrative where events appear coordinated even if they're not. This is classic media manipulation, and the more subtle, the more effective. Next, we have the methodology, or lack thereof, behind Goodyear's report. Critics have been very clear about how thin the data analysis is. The company claims to have monitored tens of thousands of posts from thousands of users across multiple platforms, yet there's no transparency about how posts were sampled, how accounts were verified, or how the algorithms distinguished between organic discourse and coordinated activity. In short, it's impossible for the public to assess the validity of their conclusions. And yet, mainstream outlets reported on it as if it were fact. Rolling Stone even framed the narrative as though there were coordinated inauthentic accounts pushing false stories about Taylor, implying the existence of a hidden network influencing public opinion. This is the perfect storm: a small, unknown company producing a report, a sympathetic journalist, a major publication, and a narrative ready-made for viral consumption. Social media users immediately began debating the findings. On platforms like Reddit, TikTok, and X, fans dissected every post, screenshot, and comment. Swifties defended Taylor fiercely, while skeptics pointed out that the same data could easily be interpreted as typical fan disagreements or organic criticism. The result was confusion and endless speculation, and the original nuance of the report, if there was any, was completely lost. Now, let's dive into the PR aspect. Tree Payne, Taylor's publicist, reportedly refused to be quoted directly but wanted to provide background information. Why does that matter? Because it suggests Taylor's team wanted some level of influence over how the story was framed, without taking responsibility for the words themselves. In other words, they wanted plausible deniability while still shaping the narrative. This is a tactic we've seen before in Hollywood: feed information indirectly to sympathetic outlets to create a narrative advantage, then remain publicly neutral. And here's where it gets even more interesting: the article explicitly links the supposed bot activity to criticism Taylor received about Nazi imagery, appropriation of African American vernacular, and comparisons to other artists. Yet, as critics have noted, much of the criticism Taylor faced was completely organic. Fans, commentators, and social media users were engaging in genuine discourse, discussing the album's content, lyrics, production choices, and cultural impact. By conflating these authentic critiques with inauthentic activity, the narrative becomes distorted. People start questioning whether any criticism is real, and that creates confusion, polarization, and loyalty reinforcement. Essentially, it's a way to discredit valid critiques without addressing them directly. Think about that for a second. Taylor Swift's PR team doesn't need to respond to every piece of criticism. Instead, they allow a report like Goodyear's to frame the conversation, and suddenly, dissenting opinions are automatically cast as inauthentic, malicious, or bot-driven. This is a subtle form of control over public perception. And if that reminds you of Blake Lively's tactics, you're not wrong. Blake also framed criticism in a way that allowed her to maintain control of her public image while dismissing negative press as misguided or false. In both cases, the celebrities are leveraging a combination of PR influence, media amplification, and selective transparency to shape narratives without directly confronting inconvenient truths. Now let's talk about the consequences. Once Rolling Stone published the report, the discourse exploded online. Social media became a battleground: Swifties defended her, detractors debated methodology, and casual observers were left unsure what to believe. YouTubers, TikTokers, and podcasters jumped on the story, dissecting every angle and creating a feedback loop that amplified the narrative exponentially. Even though Goodyear's report had no proven methodology, the perception of authority and the credibility of a publication like Rolling Stone gave it weight. And when perception becomes reality in the court of public opinion, the line between fact and opinion blurs. That's exactly what makes this story so fascinating from a media literacy perspective. Audiences are consuming information at scale, often without the ability or time to critically assess the source. Combine that with celebrity influence, fan loyalty, and PR maneuvering, and you have the perfect storm for misperception. What's even more wild is how the report subtly connects to Blake Lively. Critics have noted that it references overlapping fan bases and previous smear campaigns, implying continuity where there is none. This creates a psychological effect: readers assume a pattern, even if the facts don't support it. The inclusion of Justin Baldoni's name in discussions is another example. It's a subtle insinuation, suggesting a larger network of actors behind online narratives, despite no evidence. And here's a key point: timing matters. The release of this report coinciding with unsealed Blake Lively court documents isn't necessarily malicious, but it's strategic. It creates a narrative bridge between two unrelated events, encouraging audiences to connect dots that may not exist. In media studies, this is called narrative framing, and it's incredibly effective. Suddenly, casual observers think, oh, Blake's situation and Taylor's online discourse must be linked somehow, even though there's no direct correlation. This is exactly the type of manipulation that fuels debates, Reddit threads, and viral content. And the interesting part? Fans of both celebrities often participate without realizing they're amplifying a narrative constructed by media and PR. It's a fascinating feedback loop. Another layer to consider is the psychology of fan communities. Swifties, Blake Lively fans, and even neutral observers are emotionally invested in the reputations of these celebrities. When reports suggest targeted attacks, bot campaigns, or smear tactics, it triggers defensive behavior. People begin defending their chosen celebrity passionately, sometimes without critically evaluating the source or methodology. That's how a small report from a little-known company can generate massive social impact. And let's not forget the role of sympathetic journalists. The Rolling Stone writer covering the story clearly has a history of supportive coverage of Taylor Swift. That doesn't automatically invalidate the report, but it does contextualize how it was framed and why certain angles were emphasized while others were downplayed. In media, context and framing are everything. And here's another fascinating detail: the report labeled some legitimate criticism as bot-driven. For example, conversations about cultural appropriation, lyric choices, and symbolic imagery were dismissed as inorganic activity. This effectively delegitimizes valid critique, a tactic we've seen in other celebrity PR strategies. It's a subtle way to discourage dissent without ever engaging with the criticism directly. Finally, we need to consider the larger implications. If celebrity teams can influence media narratives by feeding reports to sympathetic outlets, shaping perception, and selectively providing background information, what does that mean for accountability? It's a question that goes beyond Taylor Swift or Blake Lively. It's about the way media, PR, and public perception interact in an age dominated by social media, viral narratives, and instant dissemination. And this is just scratching the surface. In Part 3, we're going to break down the potential connections between these events, why some of the claims about bots are misleading, the role of unverified sources, and what this tells us about the future of celebrity PR and fan influence. Trust me, it's going to get even deeper and more revealing, so stay tuned. Now that we've gone through Gudier's report, Rolling Stone's framing, and the connections, or apparent connections, to Blake Lively's legal saga, it's time to break down the broader picture and reveal what this all really means. First, let's address the claim that Taylor Swift's fanbase was targeted by bots or coordinated accounts. As we discussed in Part 2, the methodology of the report is vague at best. There's no clear sampling process, no documented research questions, and no transparency about how the company differentiated between real users and automated accounts. Yet the narrative was published as fact, with mainstream outlets implying that Taylor Swift was the victim of a malicious, inorganic campaign. But here's the catch: most of the criticism Taylor received was perfectly organic. Fans and critics alike were engaging in legitimate discourse, analyzing her lyrics, symbolic imagery, and public persona. By labeling these as inauthentic, the report not only mischaracterizes the nature of the critique but also amplifies a false narrative that deflects responsibility from the artist's team. This tactic mirrors the strategies Blake Lively employed during her lawsuit. In both cases, public criticism is reframed as malicious or orchestrated, allowing the celebrity to position themselves as a victim while maintaining control over the narrative. Now, let's talk about the timing and context again. The Gudier report was released just as Blake Lively's court documents were being unsealed, showing interactions between Taylor and Blake, including text messages and details about Taylor's presence during key moments in Blake's professional disputes. The overlap is striking. From a PR perspective, it's a golden opportunity to subtly link Taylor's situation with Blake's, creating a perceived pattern of attacks from unnamed or misunderstood actors. To the casual observer, it looks coordinated, even if the events are independent. Timing in PR is everything. Next, let's examine T-Pain's role as Taylor's publicist. According to The Verge, she refused to be quoted directly but was willing to provide background information. This is telling. If she had nothing to do with the report, why avoid being named? The only reason to offer background without attribution is to influence the narrative subtly while avoiding responsibility. It's a classic PR maneuver: guide the story behind the scenes, maintain plausible deniability, and control the public perception without making a direct statement. And then there's the issue of methodology, or lack thereof. Maddox, an analyst familiar with social media metrics, pointed out serious gaps in Gudier's approach: no detailed breakdown of posts by platform, no sample posts for verification, no explanation of how conclusions were drawn. Essentially, the report lacks scientific rigor, yet it was presented to the public as credible. The result? Misleading narratives that fans, media outlets, and casual observers amplified without question. And here's where the parallels to Blake Lively's case get even more fascinating. Blake's legal team similarly tried to frame criticism and opposing arguments in a way that allowed her to maintain control of her narrative while dismissing detractors. Both cases demonstrate how high-profile individuals can leverage media, PR firms, and sympathetic outlets to shape public perception, even in the absence of concrete evidence. Another important point is the use of overlapping fan bases. Both Taylor Swift and Blake Lively have extensive, passionate fan communities. Reports like Goodia's can manipulate these groups by suggesting a common enemy or orchestrated attack, thereby reinforcing loyalty and emotional investment. In essence, fans become unwitting participants in narrative control, defending their favorite celebrity against perceived threats without analyzing the source critically. Now, let's dive into the ethical questions. If PR teams and celebrity allies can feed reports to sympathetic outlets, shape public perception, and selectively provide background information, what does this mean for accountability? Ordinary criticism is easily dismissed as bot-driven or malicious. The line between valid critique and orchestrated attack becomes blurred. For journalists, analysts, and content creators, this represents a new challenge, distinguishing between real organic discourse and manipulated narratives. And for fans, it's a reminder to question the source, methodology, and motivations behind every report, especially when it aligns too neatly with a celebrity's desired image. But what about the actual impact? Beyond media perception, the narratives generated by these reports influence public discourse on social media. TikTok videos, Reddit threads, YouTube analyses, and Twitter X posts all amplified the perception of an organized smear campaign. Some fans took it as evidence of malicious intent, others as proof of celebrity PR influence, and still others as confirmation bias for pre-existing beliefs. Either way, the result is the same: the perception of controversy drives engagement, discussion, and loyalty reinforcement, regardless of the underlying facts. And we can't ignore the timing again. As Blake Lively's legal documents were emerging, Taylor Swift's story was simultaneously framed as a victim of inauthentic online activity. This created a psychological effect. Casual observers begin connecting dots, even when the connection doesn't exist. It's a masterclass in narrative framing. The final layer to examine is the long-term precedent. If celebrities can use small firms, sympathetic media, and selective disclosure to control perception, the implications extend beyond Swift and Lively. It sets a model for future PR strategies, where criticism is reframed, reports are selectively leaked, and fan communities are subtly guided to defend narratives without full transparency. This isn't just about one celebrity. It's about the evolving intersection of social media, journalism, and PR influence in a digital age where perception often outweighs facts. So what does this all mean for us as viewers and content consumers? First, always check the source. Who conducted the analysis, and do they have a track record of credibility? Second, consider methodology. Are conclusions drawn from verifiable data, or are they anecdotal or gut-feeling analyses? Third, examine the context. Timing, public relations influence, and media framing all play huge roles in shaping the narrative. And finally, question the motive. Why is this story being published now, and who benefits from it? In conclusion, the Goodia report, Rolling Stone article, and Taylor Swift's PR maneuvering illustrate the power and complexity of modern celebrity media management. It mirrors tactics used by Blake Lively, creating a fascinating case study of how public perception is crafted, defended, and manipulated. Fans, journalists, and casual observers are all part of this ecosystem, often unknowingly reinforcing narratives that serve celebrity interests. The key takeaway? Always approach sensational reports with skepticism, analyze the methodology, and consider the broader media and PR context. Celebrity narratives are rarely straightforward, and in the age of social media amplification, a small report from a little-known company can trigger global conversation, misinformation, and subtle image control. This concludes our deep dive into the intersection of celebrity PR, media narratives, and the tactics used by Taylor Swift and Blake Lively. Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss future breakdowns. Comment below with your thoughts. Do you think Taylor and Blake are using the same PR strategies? Or is this all overanalyzed? Either way, stay critical, stay curious, and remember, not everything you see online is what it seems. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye. Now, let's move forward and think about what this means for the broader celebrity ecosystem. When you see reports like the Goodia study or Rolling Stone articles, it's not just about one artist or one album, it's about setting a precedent. Fans, critics, and journalists are all being influenced by subtle cues: which outlets publish the story, which quotes are highlighted, which background information is given anonymously. In Taylor's case, even though her album sparked legitimate conversations, some critical, some celebratory, the framing by a small, unknown firm made it look like a coordinated attack. And here's the critical point: when celebrities, intentionally or not, allow or leverage these reports, they essentially shape public perception before anyone can properly analyze the facts. We've seen the same pattern with Blake Lively, as you know. Any criticism, whether fair or not, was reframed as harassment, orchestrated attacks, or smear campaigns. It's clever from a PR perspective but dangerous for discourse. What happens when fans begin to treat every critique as a personal attack against their idol? It creates echo chambers, diminishes nuanced discussion, and blurs the line between real wrongdoing and perceived slights. Suddenly, every online comment, tweet, or forum post is either an ally or an enemy, and moreover, the timing of reports and social narratives is critical. The overlap of Blake Lively's legal documents being unsealed and Taylor Swift's bot campaign story is no coincidence. To a casual observer, seeing these two events unfold simultaneously can create false connections, even if none exist. This is a classic PR strategy: leverage timing, ambiguity, and selective disclosure to guide audience interpretation without making overt statements. It's also important to recognize the role of publicists like Tree Payne. By offering background without direct attribution, she maintains influence over the story while avoiding accountability. That's subtle, powerful, and, frankly, common in high-profile PR circles. The lesson here for the average consumer? Always question the source, context, and potential motive behind every story. Just because something appears in a major outlet doesn't mean it's the full truth. Lastly, consider the social ripple effect. TikTok, Reddit, Twitter, X, and YouTube creators amplify these narratives endlessly. A vague report can spark days, or even weeks, of discussion, often detaching from the original facts. Fans argue over interpretations, journalists write analysis pieces, and soon, the initial study or anecdote becomes truth in popular conversation. Both Blake and Taylor have benefited from, or at least experienced, this phenomenon. Their stories show how celebrities, intentionally or not, can manipulate perception through media cycles, fan engagement, and strategic ambiguity. In conclusion, whether it's Taylor Swift, Blake Lively, or any high-profile figure, the takeaway is clear: the combination of social media, small analytical firms, and strategic PR can redefine public narratives. It challenges our ability to separate fact from perception and forces us, as consumers, to approach every story with critical thinking. Understanding these dynamics isn't just about following celebrity drama, it's about recognizing how influence, media framing, and timing shape what millions of people believe to be true. As we continue examining the unfolding narrative around Taylor Swift, Blake Lively, and the intricate interplay of celebrity, media, and public perception, it's important to recognize the structural patterns at work in modern celebrity culture. Both Blake and Taylor, albeit in different contexts, have found themselves at the center of what appears to be a self-perpetuating media phenomenon, where criticism, public perception, and PR strategy collide to create outcomes far beyond the scope of the original events. This is not merely about one tweet, one report, or one album launch. It is about how narratives are constructed, manipulated, and amplified across multiple layers of influence, from fan communities to elite media outlets, to analytical firms like Goodyear, and ultimately to mainstream platforms such as Rolling Stone, The Verge, and others. In Taylor Swift's case, the release of The Life of a Showgirl sparked a whirlwind of attention that combined genuine critical reception with highly curated narratives designed to protect or bolster her image. The Goodyear report, though thin on methodology and lacking transparency, functioned as a tool in this ecosystem, an instrument through which information could be framed in a way that subtly delegitimized valid criticism by casting it as part of a coordinated, inauthentic bot campaign. While many fans and observers reacted with enthusiasm, embracing the narrative that Swift was unfairly targeted, a closer look reveals that the report itself is emblematic of a broader problem: the misattribution of organic discourse to artificial manipulation, which in turn serves the interests of those with access to the media machinery. The implications of this are vast. When critics, whether journalists, casual listeners, or even fellow musicians, raise concerns about cultural appropriation, lyrical choices, or symbolic imagery, these critiques risk being dismissed or reframed as attacks from bad actors or bots. This phenomenon is not limited to Taylor Swift. As we have seen with Blake Lively, the ability of celebrities and their PR teams to reinterpret criticism as harassment or coordinated attacks gives them a potent mechanism for controlling public perception, often blurring the line between legitimate grievance and manufactured victimhood. In both cases, the strategy is subtle: never overtly claim power, but instead allows structural and procedural ambiguity to do the heavy lifting. To understand the mechanics of this, it's necessary to break down the flow of influence. The Goodyear report, for example, analyzed 24,679 posts from over 18,000 users across 14 platforms. While impressive on paper, the lack of transparent methodology, statistical rigor, and clear sample selection raises questions about its credibility. Even minor errors in sampling, coding, or attribution can dramatically alter the perception of who is influencing the conversation. If an unknown firm can produce a report that convinces even a single major publication to run a story, the downstream effect on public perception can be immense. When amplified by millions of fans on TikTok, X, and Reddit, these narratives acquire the appearance of consensus, even when the underlying data is questionable, and moreover, the timing of such reports is rarely coincidental. In this instance, the overlapping of Taylor Swift's album launch with the unsealing of court documents in Blake Lively's legal battle created a unique contextual synergy. For the casual observer, it could appear as though there were intentional parallels or connections between the two cases, despite the lack of factual basis. This is a classic PR tactic: leverage temporal alignment to suggest correlations, encourage speculation, and subtly guide public interpretation without needing to make explicit claims. The human brain is naturally inclined to perceive patterns, so the mere presence of overlapping timelines can amplify perceived legitimacy, even if the events are unrelated. Another key aspect is the role of intermediaries such as publicists, journalists, and analytical firms. Tree Payne, Taylor Swift's publicist, exemplifies how strategic communication can manipulate visibility and narrative control. By offering information only on background and refusing direct attribution, she maintains influence while minimizing accountability. This creates a situation in which media outlets must navigate carefully, often attributing information to unnamed sources and, inadvertently, lending credence to carefully curated messaging. In the Blake Lively scenario, similar tactics were employed: sealed documents, selective disclosures, and controlled narratives ensured that critics and the public received only a partial, curated version of events, one that amplified her victimhood while minimizing evidence contradicting her claims. This brings us to the psychological dimension. Fans and critics alike are deeply invested in narratives surrounding their favorite celebrities. When structured narratives are introduced, whether via reports, articles, or PR statements, fans often respond with confirmation bias, accepting claims that align with their pre-existing beliefs and rejecting those that do not. In Taylor's case, the framing of a bot campaigned against her reinforced the perception that she was being unfairly targeted, while in reality, much of the criticism, especially regarding cultural appropriation and lyrical content, was entirely organic. Similarly, Blake Lively's handling of her legal battle exploited fans' and observers' tendencies to assume that anyone challenging her claims was inherently biased or malicious. The result is a media landscape in which perception is curated more effectively than reality, and where celebrity influence can extend well beyond actual talent or actions. Social media platforms play a pivotal role in this ecosystem. TikTok, X, Reddit, and YouTube do not simply distribute information, they shape discourse, amplify emotional content, and reward viral narratives. Short-form videos, trending hashtags, and algorithmically driven recommendation systems ensure that attention is concentrated on emotionally charged stories, regardless of factual accuracy. In practice, this means that a vague, methodologically weak report like Goodyear's can have outsized influence, as its key claims are distilled into viral content and simplified for mass consumption. Fans debate, creators monetize, and the narrative circulates endlessly, often detached from the original context. At this point, it's worth examining the broader implications for journalism. When outlets like Rolling Stone run a story based on a single, opaque report, they signal to audiences that the report carries legitimacy, even if it lacks methodological rigor. Journalists have a duty to interrogate sources, verify claims, and contextualize findings, yet in high-profile celebrity contexts, the pressure to break news or capitalize on trending topics can lead to surface-level reporting, which amplifies misleading narratives. The Verge's subsequent analysis helped clarify some aspects, but by then, the initial perception had already taken root in public consciousness. The lag between fact-checking and virality can result in long-lasting misconceptions, which become increasingly difficult to correct over time. Another layer of complexity comes from the interconnection between fan communities. Swifties, critics, and general pop culture observers often overlap with other fandoms, such as those surrounding Blake Lively, Ryan Reynolds, and related figures. This overlapping network of attention means that narratives can spread horizontally across different communities, creating false associations. For instance, linking criticisms of Taylor to supposed attacks on Blake Lively, and further implying Justin Baldoni's involvement, created a perception of conspiracy that had no basis in reality. This demonstrates how overlapping social networks and fan communities can amplify the reach of strategically timed narratives. The legal dimension adds yet another layer. Unsealed documents, court filings, and deposition materials are now public in ways they weren't a decade ago. Celebrities and their teams can strategically release, or leak, specific elements to guide interpretation, either by fueling speculation or reinforcing desired perceptions. Taylor's alleged involvement, Blake's sealed testimony, and the concurrent media coverage illustrate how legal transparency, or the selective lack thereof, can intersect with media strategy. Courts are no longer isolated from public opinion, and PR teams increasingly consider how filings and evidence might be perceived by fans and critics alike.